My son Dustin sat across from me at the lawyer's office, smirking like he'd already won the lottery. "Face it, Dad, you're getting nothing from Mom's $34 million will," he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. But when the lawyer read that one sentence, Dustin's smug smile vanished instantly. The screaming that followed was so loud it shook the walls, and I finally understood what real justice looked like. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. The mahogany office smelled like old leather and expensive cologne. I sat in the stiff chair, my calloused hands folded in my lap, watching my 28-year-old son Dustin lean back like he owned the place. He'd arrived 20 minutes late, strolling in with that familiar swagger that reminded me of his mother during her ruthless business years. "Sorry I'm late," Dustin announced, not sounding sorry at all. "Traffic was murder. But hey, we all know why we're really here, right?" He glanced around at Margaret's relatives, her sister Linda, business partner Carol, and a few cousins I barely recognized. All of them had given him polite smiles, the kind reserved for someone they expected to inherit millions. Attorney Harrison, a silver-haired man in his 60s, shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. The will sat there like a loaded weapon, thick and bound with a blue ribbon. I'd helped Margaret organize those same papers 25 years ago when we were still married, when the estate was worth maybe $50,000 and consisted mainly of her grandfather's old pocket watch and some dusty furniture. "Dad's just here as a formality," Dustin continued with that condescending tone he'd perfected in high school, part theater, part cruelty. "I mean, let's be realistic. Mom and Dad were divorced 15 years ago. She built her empire after he was out of the picture." He adjusted his expensive suit jacket, probably worth more than I made in a month doing handyman work. "No offense, Dad, but we both know you weren't exactly business material." The casual dismissal stung, but I'd grown accustomed to it over the years. Margaret had built her consulting business into a multi-million-dollar operation after our divorce, and I'd gone from being a promising artist with gallery representation to fixing leaky faucets and painting suburban houses. The transformation from creative dreamer to blue-collar laborer had been so gradual, so necessary, that I'd almost forgotten the man I used to be. Carol shifted in her leather chair, clearly uncomfortable with Dustin's public humiliation of his father. She'd known me back in the early days, when Margaret and I were still partners in every sense of the word, but she said nothing, probably thinking it wasn't her place to interfere in family dynamics. Dustin's eyes swept the room like a politician working a crowd, reading faces and calculating allegiances. "I'm not being cruel, just practical. Dad never contributed anything valuable to Mom's success. Hell, he couldn't even make it as an artist." The words hit their target with surgical precision, designed to wound in front of witnesses. At least Mom had vision. She saw opportunities where others saw obstacles. She built something that mattered. Linda exchanged a worried glance with Carol, remembering a different version of our story. They both knew there had been sacrifices made, choices that weren't as black and white as Dustin was painting them. But time has a way of rewriting history to favor the winners. "Dustin," Linda said quietly, her voice carrying a warning note that reminded me of Margaret during her more diplomatic moments. "Perhaps we should let Mr. Harrison proceed with the reading." But Dustin was on a roll, feeding off his own momentum and the captive audience. "The truth is, Dad, you've been living off Mom's generosity for years. The divorce settlement, the birthday checks, the little loans she never expected back. We all know it." He gestured around the room as if speaking for everyone present, then leaned forward with a cruel smile. "Face it, Dad, you're getting nothing from Mom's $34 million will," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough that every person in the room could hear the dismissal, the finality of it. Attorney Harrison cleared his throat, a sound that cut through Dustin's monologue like a judge's gavel calling for order. "Actually, there's something important I need to mention before we begin the formal reading." His voice carried an odd note, something between amusement and anticipation that made me look at him more carefully. "Your mother made some significant changes to her will in the final weeks before her passing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I noticed Carol sit up straighter, her business instincts suddenly alert. Linda's expression shifted from uncomfortable to curious, and even the cousins who had been whispering among themselves fell silent. Dustin's confident smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself with forced brightness. "What kind of changes?" His voice had lost some of its theatrical warmth, becoming more clipped and businesslike. "I mean, Mom was pretty clear about her intentions. She always said the business should stay in the family, with people who understood her vision." "Changes that I believe will surprise everyone present," Harrison said, his fingers drumming lightly against the document in a rhythm that seemed to underscore the growing tension. He glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was that sympathy or something else entirely? Mrs. Mitchell was very specific about how she wanted this information revealed. Very specific indeed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I noticed Carol sit up straighter, her business instincts suddenly alert. Linda's expression shifted from uncomfortable to curious, and even the cousins who had been whispering among themselves fell silent. Dustin's confident smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself with forced brightness. "What kind of changes?" His voice had lost some of its theatrical warmth, becoming more clipped and businesslike. "I mean, Mom was pretty clear about her intentions. She always said the business should stay in the family, with people who understood her vision." "Changes that I believe will surprise everyone present," Harrison said, his fingers drumming lightly against the document in a rhythm that seemed to underscore the growing tension. He glanced at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was that sympathy or something else entirely? Mrs. Mitchell was very specific about how she wanted this information revealed. Very specific indeed. Linda leaned forward. She seemed different in those last few months, more reflective, like she was trying to understand things that had been bothering her for years. "She started asking questions about Daniel," Linda said, using my first name with unexpected gentleness. "About his art, about what he'd given up. She even had me help her research some things." Dustin's face went through micro-expressions: confusion, annoyance, then forced confidence. Whatever Mom was thinking near the end, she wasn't herself. The medication, the stress. He waved his hand dismissively. She knew I was the one who supported her vision, who understood business. Dad here spent 25 years as a glorified handyman. The word glorified hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. I felt my jaw clench, my hands forming fists before I consciously relaxed them. This was exactly the kind of moment where Margaret would have expected me to defend myself, to fight back. But I'd learned long ago that sometimes the best response to cruelty is silence. Harrison's pen tapped against his desk. "Well, I think we should begin formal reading. Some questions will answer themselves." He reached for the will with both hands. "I should warn you all, Mrs. Mitchell was very thorough in her final instructions. Very thorough indeed." The room fell silent except for distant traffic and whispered papers. Somewhere in those legal paragraphs lay answers to questions I hadn't even realized I'd been asking. Margaret had always been unpredictable, but this felt different, bigger than her usual dramatic gestures. Dustin settled back, that smirk returning. He'd already done the math. Even if I got something, maybe a token 5 or 10,000, it would still leave him with the vast majority of Margaret's fortune. Enough to quit his mediocre sales job and live the lifestyle he'd always believed he deserved. But something in Attorney Harrison's expression suggested that Dustin's calculations might be spectacularly wrong. The lawyer's words transported me back 27 years to a cramped Brooklyn studio where paint tubes lay scattered across makeshift tables and canvases leaned against every wall. Back when my name appeared in art magazines with phrases like emerging talent and promising new voice in contemporary American painting. I was 31 then, riding the wave of my first solo exhibition at a respectable Soho gallery. The New York Times art critic had written 3 paragraphs about my work, calling it raw, honest, and surprisingly mature for such a young artist. Gallery owner Marcus Chen had pulled me aside after the opening, his eyes bright with possibility. "Daniel, this could be your breakthrough year. I've got collectors asking about your future pieces." That same week, Margaret told me she was pregnant. I remember the exact moment, standing in our tiny kitchen while she held the test in her trembling hands. The morning light filtered through our single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like hope itself. "We're going to be parents," she'd whispered, and the joy in her voice made my heart swell with love so fierce it physically hurt. But joy doesn't pay for cribs or baby formula or health insurance. My paintings sold for $800 to $1,500 each, and even in my best month, I'd only moved 3 pieces. Margaret was working as a junior consultant, making barely enough to cover our rent. The math was brutal. Promising artist plus a pregnant wife equals certain poverty. I made the decision that night, sitting in my studio surrounded by half-finished canvases that represented years of dreaming. I picked up the phone and called my cousin Rick, who ran a construction company. "You still looking for someone with steady hands?" I asked. "I might know a guy." Within a month, I'd traded my paintbrushes for power tools. The gallery kept 3 of my best pieces on consignment, but I had to sell everything else. Easels, paints, the expensive lighting system I'd saved for months to afford. Marcus Chen looked genuinely sad when I told him I was stepping away from art. "You're making a mistake, Daniel. Artists like you don't come around often." "The world will have to wait," I'd replied. "My family needs security more than the art world needs another painter." Margaret's business instincts emerged during her pregnancy. She'd study consulting contracts, asking sharp questions about client retention and profit margins. "I could do this better," she'd mutter, reading trade publications while rubbing her growing belly. I supported her ambition even as my hands grew rough from construction work and my creative spirit slowly died. When Dustin was born, Margaret took only 6 weeks of maternity leave before diving back into work with unprecedented intensity. "I'm building something for our family," she'd tell me during late nights when she'd come home energized while I collapsed exhausted from 10-hour days hanging drywall. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd given up my art to provide stability, but Margaret's growing success meant that my sacrifice had been unnecessary. Her consulting firm landed its first major client when Dustin was 8 months old. Suddenly, Margaret was making more in a month than I made in a year. "You could go back to painting," she suggested one evening. "We can afford it now." But something had died in those months of physical labor, something I couldn't resurrect with good intentions. My artistic eye had dulled, my creative confidence shattered. When I picked up a brush now, my hand shook with uncertainty rather than inspiration. Margaret's success accelerated like a rocket. By Dustin's 5th birthday, she employed 12 people and was being profiled in business magazines. She bought us a house in Westchester with a separate studio space for me, a room that remained mostly empty except for dusty easels and dried-up paint. I watched my son grow up believing that his father was simply the man who fixed things while his mother conquered the business world. Dustin's earliest memories were of Mommy in sharp suits heading off to important meetings while Daddy wore work clothes and spoke about leaky pipes and electrical problems. The shift in Margaret's attitude toward me was gradual but unmistakable. As her confidence grew, her respect for my choices diminished. She began making decisions without consulting me. I became a supporting character in the story of her success, useful for practical matters but irrelevant to important conversations. "Daniel fixed the garage door today," she'd tell dinner guests, with a tone that was supposed to sound appreciative but felt condescending. "He's so handy with mechanical things." The subtext was clear. I was the help, not the partner. Dustin absorbed these dynamics with ruthless clarity. He learned to dismiss his father's opinions, to see manual work as beneath consideration, to equate financial success with personal worth. By adolescence, he'd perfected the casual insult disguised as concern. "Dad, maybe you should consider going back to school. Learn something practical for the modern economy." The final blow came during Dustin's senior year when he discovered some of my old paintings in the basement. Instead of curiosity or pride, his reaction was embarrassment. "God, Dad, these are so dramatic. No wonder you couldn't make it as an artist. They look like something from a community college art show." He'd said it casually, thoughtlessly, the way teenagers dismiss anything that doesn't fit their understanding of coolness. But the words hit me with the force of 20 years of accumulated disappointment and self-doubt. That night, I quietly moved the remaining paintings to a storage unit across town. Margaret filed for divorce when Dustin was in college. "We've grown into different people," she explained with clinical detachment. I need someone who matches my energy, my ambitions, someone who challenges me intellectually. The settlement was generous, more generous than I deserved, considering I'd contributed little to the fortune she'd built. I took enough to buy a modest apartment and start a small handyman business, leaving Margaret the house, the cars, and the majority of her wealth intact. I saw less of Dustin after that, despite living only 20 minutes away. He was busy with internships at Margaret's company, then climbing the ladder at his own sales job. Our conversations became stilted exchanges of practical information, holiday plans, health updates, weather observations that filled the silence where understanding should have lived. Now sitting in Attorney Harrison's office, I wondered if Margaret had ever looked back on those early years with anything resembling regret. Had she remembered the man who'd given up his dreams to support hers? Harrison's voice brought me back to the present. Before we begin the formal reading, I need to explain that Mrs. Mitchell spent considerable time in her final months researching certain historical matters. She hired a private investigator and reached out to several people from the past. Dustin's smirk faltered slightly. What kind of research? The kind that changes how one sees the story of their life, Harrison replied cryptically, his eyes meeting mine across the desk. Mrs. Mitchell discovered some things that surprised even her. Harrison opened the will with ceremonial gravity, like a priest revealing sacred scripture. The heavy paper crackled as he unfolded it, and I noticed his hands were completely steady, the hands of a man who had delivered life-changing news countless times before. I, Margaret Elizabeth Mitchell, being of sound mind and body. His voice carried the dry authority of decades spent translating human drama into legal terminology. The formal phrases washed over the room like a familiar liturgy: assets, bequests, executors, while Dustin drummed his fingers impatiently against his chair's leather armrest. I could see him doing calculations in his head, probably planning how he'd spend his inheritance. The vacation home in the Hamptons he'd always wanted, the sports car, maybe even quitting his sales job altogether. "Get to the good part," Dustin muttered under his breath, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We all know how this goes. Mom wasn't sentimental about business." Harrison paused in his reading, looking up from the document with an expression that might have been pity mixed with professional fascination. "Actually, Dustin, I think you'll find this quite different from your expectations." He cleared his throat and continued, his voice taking on a more dramatic cadence. "To my former husband, Daniel Hayes, the artist who sacrificed his destined greatness for our family, I leave the sum of $5 million. The words hit the room like a physical blow, sucking the air out of the space and leaving everyone stunned into silence. I felt my own breath catch in my throat. $5 million. The number seemed impossibly large, impossibly generous. I hadn't expected anything, had convinced myself over the years that Margaret viewed our marriage as a business arrangement that had simply run its course. Dustin's confident posture crumbled as if someone had pulled the supporting wires from a marionette. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish gasping for air. His face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, confusion, anger, and then something that looked almost like fear. The mathematical certainty he'd been carrying around for weeks suddenly didn't add up anymore. $5 million? Dustin's voice cracked like a teenager's going through puberty. For what? For giving up? For quitting when things got hard? He looked around the room desperately, seeking allies who might share his outrage, but found only faces turned away in embarrassment. "This is insane. Mom knew Dad never amounted to anything. She used to joke about his artistic phase, like it was some embarrassing college experimentation." Linda shifted uncomfortably in her seat, exchanging meaningful glances with Carol. The family dynamics were becoming clearer by the moment, painted in stark relief by Margaret's posthumous revelations. I could see them both reassessing years of family gatherings, remembering conversations they'd dismissed or overlooked. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. Vindication that Margaret had finally recognized something I'd given up. Sorrow that it had taken her death to acknowledge it. The money felt less important than the recognition, the public acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, my sacrifice had meant something to her after all. Harrison held up a hand for silence, his authority cutting through Dustin's protests like a sharp blade. "There's more. Quite a bit more, actually." He turned the page with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment like a master storyteller approaching his climax. The rustling of paper seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "But first, let me read Mrs. Mitchell's explanation for this particular bequest." He adjusted his glasses again, and I noticed his eyes had taken on a different quality, almost gentle, as he began to read Margaret's own words. "Daniel, I have spent months researching your interrupted legacy, learning about the artistic career I convinced you to abandon. I discovered that your early work was not the amateur dabbling I had dismissed, but the beginning of what critics believed would be a remarkable artistic journey. I owe you an apology that I can only deliver through this document, and a debt I can only partially repay through this inheritance." The room fell into stunned silence. Even Dustin seemed momentarily speechless. I felt tears prick at my eyes, not tears of joy, but of profound sadness for all the years of misunderstanding and diminished expectations. Harrison paused before continuing. "However, Mrs. Mitchell left specific instructions about how the remainder of her estate should be handled." His eyes found Dustin's face. "But there's more I need to explain about your mother's final months and the discoveries that led to these decisions." Dustin straightened, reasserting his confidence. "Whatever Mom discovered, it doesn't change the fundamental facts. I'm her son. I supported her business. I understood her vision." His voice grew stronger. "Dad got his acknowledgement, fine, but $29 million is still $29 million. "About that," Harrison said quietly, and the room's temperature seemed to drop. Carol leaned forward, her business instincts picking up on subtle cues. "Mr. Harrison, are you suggesting there are additional complications?" "Not complications," Harrison replied. "Revelations." Mrs. Mitchell was very thorough in her final investigations. She hired Detective Raymond Pierce, a retired investigator who specializes in financial irregularities. He paused. She also reached out to several people from Daniel's past, gallery owners, art critics, fellow artists who remembered his work. My heart began to race. Margaret had reached out to Marcus Chen, to the other artists I'd known during those brief, shining years. The thought that she'd spent her final months researching the life I'd given up was both touching and terrifying. Linda spoke up carefully. Margaret mentioned she was having some conversations with people from the old days. She seemed troubled by some of the things she was learning. "Troubled is one way to put it," Harrison said. Apparently, Mrs. Mitchell had been operating under some significant misunderstandings about both her family's past and present. His fingers found a section marked with a yellow sticky note. She was particularly interested in learning about Daniel's artistic potential, and what the art world might have looked like if he'd continued painting. Dustin's face flushed red. "This is ridiculous. You're talking about ancient history, about some fantasy career that never existed. Dad was a struggling artist who couldn't pay his bills. Mom built something real, something substantial. I helped her build it." "Did you?" Harrison's question hung in the air like a challenge. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Something in Harrison's tone suggested we were approaching the heart of whatever Margaret had discovered. Dustin sensed it too. I could see the first flicker of genuine fear in his eyes, quickly masked by aggressive bluster. "Of course I helped her," Dustin snapped. "I worked summers at her company through college. I provided insights into younger demographics, helped her understand emerging market trends. I was instrumental in several of her biggest client acquisitions." Harrison nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the response he'd been expecting. "Mrs. Mitchell was particularly interested in investigating those client acquisitions you mentioned. She had Detective Pierce examine the financial records quite closely." He paused. What she discovered was illuminating. The word seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Dustin's confident facade was beginning to show cracks. He looked around the room again, but this time found no reassuring faces, only curious and increasingly suspicious expressions. "I don't know what you think you found," Dustin said, his voice rising, "but I've never done anything but support my mother's business interests. Every suggestion I made, every client I helped her connect with was legitimate and above board." "I'm sure it was," Harrison said mildly. Mrs. Mitchell never questioned your business ethics, Dustin. She was more interested in your personal ethics, particularly regarding your relationship with your father. And there it was, the thread that, when pulled, would unravel everything. I could see it in Harrison's expression, in the way Linda's eyes widened with understanding, in the sudden pallor that drained the color from Dustin's face. Margaret hadn't just researched my abandoned art career, she'd investigated the dynamics of our family. Harrison reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a manila envelope thick with papers. Mrs. Mitchell left very specific instructions about how these findings should be presented, he said. She wanted everyone in this room to understand the complete picture before we proceeded with the final distribution of her estate. Dustin's hands were shaking now, though he tried to hide it. What complete picture? What are you talking about? The picture of a son who systematically undermined his father's confidence and self-worth, Harrison said quietly. The picture of a young man who learned to weaponize his mother's success against his father's perceived failures. The picture of someone who forgot that love should be stronger than ambition and respect is more valuable than money. The truth was finally emerging from its hiding place, and judging by the expression on Dustin's face, he knew exactly what was coming next. Harrison opened the manila envelope with deliberate care, extracting a thick folder. Mrs. Mitchell was particularly thorough in her research, he began. She contacted Marcus Chen from the Soho Gallery, several art critics who reviewed Daniel's early work, and even tracked down some of his contemporaries from the 1990s art scene. The mention of Marcus Chen's name hit me like a physical blow. After all these years, Margaret had reached out to the man who'd believed in my talent when I'd stopped believing in it myself. What she learned, Harrison continued, removing a newspaper clipping, was that Daniel Hayes was not the struggling amateur she'd convinced herself he was. According to Mr. Chen, Daniel was on the verge of major representation. The Whitney Museum had expressed preliminary interest in his work for a group exhibition. 2 prominent collectors had placed informal holds on pieces from his next series. Dustin's face went through rapid expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear. "That's impossible," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "If Dad was so successful, why did he quit?" "Because," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading began, "I loved your mother. I loved you, even before you were born. And I thought providing stability was more important than chasing artistic dreams that might never pay the bills." The room fell silent, the weight of 27 years of misunderstanding settling over us. Harrison nodded at me with something approaching respect before continuing. "Mrs. Mitchell also discovered something else, something about the timing of certain events in your family's history." He pulled out a hospital record, yellowed with age but text still visible. "Your mother had Detective Pierce investigate the exact timeline of Daniel's career transition. What they found was that Daniel had received a significant offer from a major gallery just 3 days before he accepted the construction job." My breath caught. I'd never told Margaret about that offer. A guaranteed monthly stipend in exchange for exclusive representation, enough money to support a small family while I continued to paint. But there had been a catch that made it impossible to accept. The offer, Harrison continued, reading from a photocopied letter, was for $2,000 per month guaranteed income, plus a 60-40 split on all sales, with the gallery providing studio space and materials in Los Angeles. He looked up. In 1996, that was equivalent to a middle-class salary with unlimited upside potential. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Linda leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Los Angeles?" "But Margaret was experiencing severe pregnancy complications," I said quietly, the memory flooding back. "She was on bed rest. The doctors said any travel, any stress could cause her to lose the baby. I couldn't move her across the country, and I couldn't leave her alone in New York." I looked around the room, seeing the understanding dawn on their faces. I had 3 days to decide between my artistic future and my family's immediate needs. There was no real choice. Dustin's face had gone completely white. For the first time, he was seeing the full picture, not just a father who had given up on art, but a man who had sacrificed a spectacular career opportunity to stay by his pregnant wife's side during a medical crisis. "But that's not the most important thing Mrs. Mitchell discovered," Harrison said, his voice growing quieter. She also learned about the hospital visit. I felt my heart skip a beat. The hospital visit. 3 days before Margaret died, when I'd driven across town to see her one last time. Linda leaned forward, her expression softening. Margaret told me about that visit afterward. She said you brought her flowers and sat with her for 2 hours, not talking about money or wills or anything practical, just being present. I wanted to say goodbye, I said simply, and to tell her that I'd never regretted the choices I made, that loving her and raising our son was worth more than any painting I might have created. Dustin stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and panic. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice sharp with sarcasm, "but it doesn't change anything. Dad made his choices. Mom built her empire. I supported her vision." Harrison set down the papers and looked directly at Dustin. "Your mother was particularly interested in understanding your role in the family dynamics. She had Detective Pierce examine some very specific aspects of your relationship with your father." Dustin's aggressive posture faltered slightly. I saw something flicker behind his eyes, the look of someone who suddenly realizes they might not be as untouchable as they'd believed. "She hired a psychological consultant to review recorded family interactions," Harrison continued, pulling out another folder. "Home videos, audio recordings from family gatherings, even some security footage from your mother's offices during family events." My stomach clenched. Margaret had been more thorough than I'd ever imagined. "What she found," Harrison said, opening the folder, "was a consistent pattern of behavior spanning nearly 2 decades. Subtle undermining, deliberate diminishment, calculated cruelty disguised as concern or humor." He pulled out a transcript covered with highlighted text. "This is from your mother's 70th birthday party, recorded on her home security system. Quote, 'Dad's been talking about maybe picking up painting again as a hobby. Isn't that cute? Like those old guys who take up golf and think they're going to be the next Tiger Woods.' End quote." The words hung in the air like poison gas. I remembered that moment, remembered the laughter from Margaret's business associates, remembered the way my tentative excitement about returning to art had withered under public ridicule. "Or this one," Harrison continued, flipping to another page, "from Christmas dinner 2 years ago. Quote, 'Dad's handyman business is doing well, considering. I mean, it's not like he's running a real company or anything, but he keeps busy, and that's what matters at his age.' End quote." Dustin's face was cycling through colors, red with anger, white with fear, flushed with embarrassment. Those were just jokes. Family ribbing. Everyone does that. "Do they?" Linda's voice cut through the tension. "Because I've been thinking about this since Margaret told me about her research, and I realized something. I've never heard you say anything genuinely kind about your father. Not once. Not in all the years I've known you." The accusation hung in the air. Dustin looked around desperately, seeking allies, but found only faces filled with growing understanding and disappointment. "Your mother spent her final weeks wondering if she had created a monster," Harrison said quietly. "She wondered if her success had taught you to value only achievement and money, to see your father's sacrifice as weakness rather than love." The room fell into complete silence except for Dustin's labored breathing. His world was crumbling around him. But then, suddenly, Dustin's expression changed. The panic disappeared, replaced by cold fury. "Wait!" he shouted, standing so abruptly that his chair rolled backward. "This is all Dad's manipulation. 3 days before Mom died, he visited her hospital room. I saw him. This whole thing is his scheme to steal our money." The accusation hit like a thunderbolt. Family members who had been looking at Dustin with disappointment suddenly turned suspicious eyes toward me. "He poisoned her mind against me when she was weak," Dustin continued, his voice rising to near hysteria. "She was on medication, confused, vulnerable. He played on her guilt about the divorce, convinced her to change the will." I felt the blood drain from my face. This was my son, accusing me of the most despicable kind of manipulation. But Linda stood up slowly, her face set with determination. "Dustin," she said quietly, "that's not what happened. Your father came to say goodbye and ask for forgiveness. Your mother had already changed the will 2 weeks before that visit. She made her decision based on the detective's report and her own discoveries, not anything your father said." Dustin frantically looked around the room for support. "You all believe this?" he demanded. "He's manipulating all of us." But everyone remained silent, uncomfortable, shifting away from him. The realization dawned on his face. He was completely alone. Linda reached into her purse and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Your mother left this for you, Dustin," she said, her voice heavy with sadness. "She asked me to give it to you after the truth came out." Dustin's hands shook as he tore open the envelope. His eyes moved frantically across the page, his expression changing from defiance to shock to something that might have been the first flicker of genuine remorse I'd seen from him in years. For a long moment, Dustin stood frozen, the letter crumpled in his trembling hands. His face showed a complex mixture of emotions, half believing, half broken, with hints of late regret quickly being suppressed by pride and anger. This isn't over," he said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. He stuffed the letter into his pocket and walked toward the door, his earlier swagger replaced by the uncertain gait of someone whose world had just collapsed. The heavy silence he left behind felt like the aftermath of a terrible accident, and I realized that Harrison hadn't even revealed the final twist yet. But suddenly, the silence was broken by something extraordinary. Through the thick walls of the law office, we could actually hear Dustin's voice from the hallway, screaming so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The sound was raw, primal, like an animal in agony, and it went on for what felt like minutes before finally fading as he presumably left the building. Harrison waited until Dustin's footsteps disappeared before speaking again. His expression had changed from professional detachment to something approaching wonder. "Well," he said quietly, "that was illuminating, but we're not finished yet." He reached for another section of the will, bound with a different colored ribbon. Mrs. Mitchell left very specific instructions about what should happen if Dustin reacted exactly as he just did. Linda dabbed at her eyes. She predicted he would do that? She hoped he wouldn't, Harrison replied, but she was a businesswoman who understood human nature. She planned for multiple contingencies. He opened the new section, revealing pages covered with Margaret's distinctive handwriting. This is where things become truly extraordinary. My heart was still racing from Dustin's accusations. The $5 million felt surreal. But Harrison's face suggested that the biggest surprises were yet to come. Mrs. Mitchell discovered something else during her research into Daniel's artistic career, Harrison continued, pulling out a folder marked with my name. She didn't just contact people from your past, Daniel. She contacted people from the present art world, gallery owners, collectors, auction houses. She wanted to understand what your career might look like if you returned to painting today. I felt my breath catch. She did what? She had art experts examine photographs of your early work, the pieces she managed to track down through auction records and private collections. The consensus was remarkable. Harrison pulled out what appeared to be a professional art appraisal. Your early paintings, which sold for hundreds of dollars in the 1990s, are now worth between $15,000 and $25,000 each. The art world, it seems, never forgot Daniel Hayes. The numbers didn't compute in my mind. My paintings, the ones I'd sold for grocery money 27 years ago, were now worth more than most people's cars? Linda gasped audibly. But that's not the most remarkable part, Harrison continued. Mrs. Mitchell didn't just research your past work. She commissioned a study of your potential future in the art world. He pulled out another document from a prestigious New York gallery. She contacted the Sterling Contemporary Gallery in Chelsea. They specialize in rediscovered artists and career resurrections. She asked them a hypothetical question. What would happen if Daniel Hayes returned to painting today? The Sterling Contemporary. I knew the name. It was one of the most respected mid-tier galleries in New York. The thought that Margaret had approached them about me was both thrilling and terrifying. Their response, Harrison said, beginning to read from the gallery's letterhead, was unequivocal. Quote, based on the maturity evident in Mr. Hayes's early work and the decades of life experience he has since gained, we believe he could become one of the most compelling artistic voices of his generation. The art world is hungry for authentic narratives of sacrifice, loss, and redemption. Mr. Hayes' story, combined with his evident talent, could generate significant interest from both critics and collectors. End quote. I felt tears welling up, Not from sadness this time, but from a complex mixture of regret and possibility. Margaret had spent her final months not just apologizing for the past, but trying to engineer a future I'd never dared to imagine. "The sterling contemporary expressed serious interest in representing you," Harrison continued. "They've proposed a full retrospective exhibition featuring your old work alongside new pieces. They believe such a show could generate sales in the 6 to 7 figure range." 6 to 7 figures. For paintings. For my paintings. It was more money than I'd made in the past 5 years combined. But Harrison wasn't finished. Mrs. Mitchell was so intrigued by this possibility that she took it upon herself to facilitate your return to art. He reached for yet another folder, thick with photographs and architectural plans. She purchased a property in the Hudson Valley, a 19th-century estate with a converted carriage house that's been transformed into a professional artist's studio. My heart stopped. She bought me a studio? She bought you more than a studio, Daniel. She bought you a complete artistic infrastructure. Harrison spread out photographs showing a spacious, light-filled workspace with professional easels, organized art supplies, and large north-facing windows. The property includes living quarters, so you could focus entirely on your art without worrying about mundane concerns. Linda covered her mouth, clearly moved by the scope of Margaret's planning. She really thought of everything, didn't she? She did indeed, Harrison confirmed. But we haven't reached the truly extraordinary part yet. He pulled out the final document, bound in red leather. This is Mrs. Mitchell's real masterpiece, the complete rewriting of her estate distribution. After everything that had happened, I'd almost forgotten that there were still $29 million unaccounted for. Mrs. Mitchell's final instructions were very clear, Harrison said, his voice taking on the formal tone of legal pronouncement. Quote, "If my son Dustin responds to these revelations with anger, denial, and continued disrespect for his father, if he proves himself incapable of growth, humility, or genuine remorse, then I want him to receive exactly what he believed his father deserved. Nothing." The words hit the room like a physical blow. The finality of Margaret's judgment was breathtaking. "The entire remainder of the estate," Harrison continued, $34 million minus the $5 million already bequeathed to Daniel, is to be placed in a trust called the Daniel Hayes Art Foundation. The foundation will provide grants to struggling artists, fund art education programs, and purchase Daniel's future work at fair market value to ensure his financial security while he rebuilds his career. I couldn't speak. The magnitude of what Margaret had done, not just the money but the careful orchestration of justice and redemption, was overwhelming. She'd turned her final act into a masterpiece of human drama. "However," Harrison said, his voice softening, "Mrs. Mitchell left one final provision. If Dustin returns within 48 hours, if he offers a genuine apology to his father and demonstrates real understanding of his behavior, the will can be modified to provide him with a modest inheritance, enough to live comfortably, but not enough to avoid the consequences of his actions." Linda wiped away tears, clearly moved by her sister's combination of justice and mercy. She really did love him, didn't she? "She loved them both," Harrison replied, "but she understood that sometimes love requires difficult truths and hard consequences." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the complete transformation of my life. $29 million dedicated to art, to helping other artists avoid the sacrifice I'd been forced to make. A professional studio waiting for me, recognition from the art world that I'd never stopped mattering. But more than the money, more than the opportunities, was the knowledge that Margaret had finally understood. She'd seen past the narrative of failure to recognize the love and sacrifice that had shaped our family's story. Her final gift wasn't just wealth, it was the restoration of dignity, purpose, and hope. For the first time in 27 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. The electric anticipation of holding a paintbrush, the possibility that my best work might still lie ahead, and the knowledge that love, even complicated, painful, misunderstood love, had finally won. Harrison began gathering the documents, but I had one more question. "The gallery," I said quietly. "The sterling contemporary. Are they really interested, or was this just hypothetical? Harrison smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from him all day. Oh, it was quite real, Daniel. In fact, I have a card here from Sarah Sterling herself. She's expecting your call. 3 months later, I stood in my new studio as morning light streamed through tall north-facing windows, illuminating an easel that held my first painting in 27 years. The canvas was still wet, oils glistening with that particular quality that had once been as familiar to me as breathing. My hands, no longer rough from construction work, but soft and steady from weeks of preparation, held a brush loaded with cadmium yellow, ready to add the final highlights to what would become the centerpiece of my comeback exhibition. The painting was a portrait of my own hands as they had been during those construction years, calloused, paint-stained from house jobs, but somehow still graceful. The hands of a man who had carried art in his soul even when he could no longer create it. Sarah Sterling from the Sterling Contemporary had wept when she first saw it during her visit the previous week. "This is it," she'd said, her voice filled with quiet excitement mixed with professional awe. "This is the piece that will make people understand what you sacrificed, what you've regained. The artist's hands. It tells the whole story without saying a word. We'll position it at the center of the gallery, the focal point that draws everything together." The response to my exhibition announcement had exceeded everyone's expectations, including my own. The New York Times had run a full-feature story titled, "The Artist Who Disappeared, Daniel Hayes Returns After 27 Years." The article had been picked up by art blogs, shared on social media, and discussed in gallery circles from Soho to Chelsea. Art critics who had reviewed my early work in the 90s emerged from the archives of art history to offer their perspectives on my lost years and potential resurrection. Collectors were already inquiring about purchasing pieces sight unseen, and 3 different documentary filmmakers had reached out about following my story. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from Marcus Chen, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever. He'd driven up to the Hudson Valley studio just 2 weeks after I'd started painting again, carrying a bottle of champagne and tears in his eyes like a proud father visiting his son. "I never stopped wondering," he'd told me as we sat in the garden behind the studio, watching the late afternoon sun paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple that reminded me why I'd become an artist in the first place. Every few years, someone would ask me whatever happened to Daniel Hayes, the promising young artist who just vanished from the scene. I'd tell them I didn't know, but that I hoped someday you'd find your way back to your true calling. I kept one of your paintings from the 90s, you know, hung it in my bedroom where I'd see it every morning. It reminded me that real talent doesn't just disappear, it waits. The studio itself had become more than a workspace. It had become a kind of sanctuary where time seemed to move differently. Margaret had thought of everything, not just the physical space with its perfect lighting and professional equipment, but the emotional environment needed for serious artistic work. There were no distractions, no financial pressures, no mundane concerns about paying bills or fixing broken appliances. For the first time in my adult life, I could focus entirely on the act of creation, on the mysterious alchemy that transforms pigment and canvas into something that speaks to the human soul. The Daniel Hayes Art Foundation had been established exactly as Margaret had specified. The foundation's first grants had already been awarded to 12 struggling artists, each receiving enough money to continue their work for a full year without compromise. Reading their letters of gratitude, understanding that my story had somehow become a bridge to help others avoid the sacrifice I'd made, filled me with purpose I'd never experienced before. Dustin never returned. The 48 hours had passed without contact, then days, then weeks. Linda had tried calling him several times, but his phone went straight to voicemail. According to his former colleagues, he'd quit his sales job the day after the will reading and moved out of his apartment. Someone thought they'd seen him in California, but the lead went nowhere. I felt sadness about his absence, but not crushing guilt. Margaret's careful documentation of our family dynamics had helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for the man Dustin had become, any more than he was responsible for the dreams I'd given up. We had all made choices, and those choices had consequences that couldn't be undone by money or good intentions. The upcoming exhibition, scheduled for October, would feature 15 new paintings alongside 5 pieces from my original 90s work that the sterling contemporary had managed to acquire from private collectors. The combination would tell the story of an interrupted career, a long hibernation, and an unprecedented artistic awakening. Sarah Sterling predicted that several major museums would want to acquire pieces for their permanent collections. But beyond commercial success, beyond vindication and recognition, was something more fundamental: the simple joy of creating again. Every morning when I walked into the studio, I felt like I was coming home after a 27-year exile. The smell of oil paints, the texture of canvas, the way light moved across surfaces, all of it felt both utterly familiar and completely new. I was painting faster and with more confidence than I ever had in my youth. The decades of life experience, of loss and sacrifice and hard-won wisdom, had given my work a depth that my early paintings, however promising, had lacked. My story had become part of my art, and my art had become more powerful because of my story. As I put finishing touches on The Artist's Hands, I heard a car pulling up the gravel driveway. Through the studio window, I could see Linda getting out of her sedan, carrying what looked like a manila envelope. But when she entered the studio, her expression was different. Excited, perhaps a little nervous. "Daniel," she said, "I've got something you need to see." She held up the envelope. "It's from Dustin. He sent it to the foundation office." My heart began to race. After months of silence, what could my son possibly have to say? Linda handed me the letter, and I recognized Dustin's handwriting immediately. "Dad," the letter began, "I don't know if you'll want to read this, or if you'll believe anything I have to say. I've been living in Oregon, working construction ironically enough, and spending a lot of time thinking about Mom's letter and everything that happened. I was wrong about so many things, for so many years, that I don't know where to start apologizing. I was wrong about your art, wrong about your sacrifices, and wrong about what kind of man you are. I turned you into a failure in my mind because it was easier than admitting that you were the strongest person I knew. Strong enough to give up your dreams for the people you loved. I've been reading about your exhibition, following the articles about your comeback. I'm proud of you, Dad. In a way, I should have been my entire life. You didn't just return to art. You returned as someone better than you ever were before, and I think Mom knew that would happen. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't want anything from the foundation or the estate. I lost the right to those things when I lost sight of what really mattered. But I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Mom was trying to teach me, and what you tried to show me through all those years when I was too stupid and selfish to see it. You were never the failure in our family, Dad. I was. I hope your exhibition is everything you deserve it to be. Love, Dustin." I read the letter twice, feeling a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, hope, and something that might have been the beginning of healing. Linda watched my face carefully, trying to read my reaction. "There's more," she said gently, reaching into the envelope again. She pulled out a small photograph, faded and creased from years of handling. It showed me in my old Brooklyn studio, probably around 30 years old, standing in front of a half-finished painting with paint smudges on my clothes and complete absorption on my face. On the back of the photograph, in Dustin's handwriting, were the words, "I found this in Mom's things. She kept it all these years. I think she always knew who you really were." I set the photograph carefully on my easel, leaning it against the portrait of my weathered hands. The two images, past and present, innocence and experience, dreams lost and dreams regained, seemed to speak to each other across the decades. "What are you going to do?" Linda asked. I picked up my brush again, considering the question. Outside, the morning light was shifting, and I could see new possibilities in the shadows and highlights of my painting. There would be time to think about Dustin, time to decide whether and how to respond to his letter. Margaret's foundation would continue its work, helping other artists avoid the choice I'd been forced to make. My exhibition would open in 6 weeks, marking not just a return to art, but the beginning of what critics were already calling one of the most remarkable second acts in American painting. But right now, in this moment, there was simply the work itself, the ancient, sacred act of putting paint on canvas and making something that had never existed before. After 27 years of exile, I was finally home. "I'm going to paint," I said, adding a touch of gold to catch the morning light. "Everything else can wait." Through the studio windows, the Hudson Valley stretched away toward the horizon, and I could almost feel Margaret's presence in the quality of the light itself, approving, loving, and finally at peace with the choices we had all made. The future was unwritten, full of possibility, and for the first time in decades, I couldn't wait to discover what came next. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts about this incredible journey of redemption and second chances in the comments below. Have you ever had to sacrifice a dream for your family? Do you believe it's ever too late to reclaim your true calling? To listen to the next story, click on the video suggested on your screen.